Chapter 1. The Shape at the Glass Corridor. The first thing Clara Whitcomb saw of the house was not the house itself, but a row of lavender bundles hanging upside down in the lower pantry window, their faded purple gone nearly to grey, each tied with the same narrow cream ribbon. They turned a little in the draught from an open scullery door, as though something inside had breathed upon them. Clara, who had spent 32 years as headmistress of a girls' school in Cheltenham, and had learned that first impressions were rarely accurate but often useful, paused with her gloved hand still on the taxi door, and looked at them more attentively than most people would have done. They had been tied by someone methodical, not beautifully, methodically. Ravenscroft House stood higher up the hill than she had expected, its front too wide for grace and too handsome for comfort, built in the Edwardian taste for certainty, and altered afterwards by people with weaker convictions. The central block had a stone porch upheld by columns that had weathered into a sort of reluctant dignity. To the left ran the older residential wing, with deep sash windows and thick pale curtains. To the right, beyond a glazed passage that caught the afternoon light, there stretched the former treatment rooms of the old convalescent home, now converted, she had been told, into studios, storage rooms, and a little library that nobody used except in winter. There was a smell in the air, and not only of lavender, damp stone, furniture polish, the faint mineral coolness that rises from old tiled places even when one is not standing in them. Clara disliked the smell immediately, which annoyed her, because she had come with every intention of being sensible. The front door opened before she could ring. A woman of perhaps 64, spare and pleasant-faced, with a grey cardigan buttoned very neatly over a navy dress, came down the step with both hands extended in welcome. "Miss Whitcomb, of course, you must forgive the eagerness, but from the drawing-room window one can see the taxis coming up the hill, and I always think it's unkind to let new arrivals stand at the door feeling as though they've come to the wrong place. I'm Eleanor Price. I help manage things here, though people are so careless about titles nowadays that one ends by doing a bit of everything." Her voice was soft, practical, and touched every sentence lightly at the end, as if smoothing it into place. Clara took her hand. "You're kind," she said, "though I hope not to be too eager. Nothing is more alarming than efficiency in a strange house." Mrs. Price smiled with exactly the right amount of amusement. "Well, that depends on what it is efficient at. We are very good at tea, fair at gossip, and poor at keeping people from mislaying spectacles. Most institutions have far grimmer failings." There was something reassuring in that. Clara allowed herself to be led inside. The entrance hall had black and white tiles that had once belonged to a more ambitious decorative scheme, and now merely suggested cold ankles. A bronze umbrella stand held 3 walking sticks, a folded shooting cane, and one vulgar golf umbrella with a parrot's head handle. Against the wall stood a long table laid with flowers too deliberately arranged to be the work of chance, white stocks, and sprigs of rosemary, and one cracked bowl of late camellias. Clara's eye went to the bowl at once. It had been mended, and mended expertly, but not invisibly. Fine gold lines ran through the glaze like a map of a country after war. "I do hope the room is warm enough," said Mrs. Price. "The south side is always better, though Dr. Harbury insists the east rooms are healthier. He has spent 30 years telling people what improves them, and cannot quite stop, poor man. Dr. Harbury lives here too?" "Oh yes, Dr. Lionel Harbury in the West Suite. We have a retired solicitor, a pianist who was once moderately celebrated and is now very cross, 2 sisters who cannot bear one another and lunch together every day, and one gentleman who refers to all women under 70 as girls, which I think should be punishable. You will be comfortable here." That remained to be seen. Clara removed her gloves finger by finger. At the far end of the hall, near the door of what must be the morning room, sat an elderly lady in a soft dove-grey coat, with an absurd little spray of violets pinned to it. She was knitting something of an indeterminate beige and appeared at first glance to be attending to nothing at all. Yet when Clara and Mrs. Price drew near, the lady looked up with such mild exactness that Clara, who had once quelled a school assembly by saying only girls, in a certain tone recognised a formidable intelligence at once. "My dear Eleanor," said the lady, "you have put the flowers on the hall table too close to the radiator again. It encourages a sort of haste in them, and flowers ought not to be hurried. This must be Miss Whitcomb." "Mrs." Price turned with real warmth. "Yes, and I ought to have introduced you instantly. Miss Whitcomb, this is Miss Marple, who is staying with her nephew in Bath and has been lending us, I assure you, wholly unofficial good sense." Miss Marple's handshake was light and dry. "One hears such interesting things in places where people are supposed to rest," she said. "Villages are rather like that too. In St. Mary Mead there was a colonel's widow, Mrs. Bickerstaff, who was forever recommending quiet boarding houses for nerves. The queer thing was that every place she found had either a theft, an elopement, or an unwise engagement within a fortnight. She took it as proof of fate, though of course it was only that she liked communities where people had too much time to observe one another. Clara surprised into laughing. "He said that sounded very plausible." "It generally is," said Miss Marple. "Human beings are so consistent. One only has to notice the little domestic habits. A person will deceive you in large matters if they have reason enough, but in the small ones they are dreadfully revealing. The way they fold letters, for example, or pour milk, or tie up dried lavender." Mrs. Price had already turned toward the stairs, but Clara saw Miss Marple's eyes rest for one brief instant on the cream ribbons at the pantry end of the corridor. It was not a stare. It was the kind of glance one gives to something already placed in the mind for later use. "Miss Marple thinks of all the stories in progress," said Mrs. Price, leading on. "I have told her that if she makes a villain of me, I shall never forgive it. My dear Mrs. Price." "Forgiveness is often a matter of arrangement," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I knew a girl in St. Mary Mead, Edie Fane, who sang in the choir and looked so forgiving that people told her everything. It was very useful to her until one day the wrong person believed it. The remark might have meant anything. It might have meant nothing." Yet Clara noticed, as they mounted the stairs, that Mrs. Price's shoulders, so orderly before, had grown for an instant almost stiff beneath the cardigan. Her room overlooked the terraced lavender garden. Even at this season the bushes made low, rounded shadows against the pale gravel paths, and iron arches without roses marked the descent toward the lower gate. Inside, the room was agreeable in a careful, temporary manner. A narrow bed, a walnut chest, thin curtains washed too often. On the dressing table stood a small glass bottle holding 3 stems of rosemary, as though the house had decided scent must everywhere insist upon itself. Mrs. Price set down the valise and moved to the mantel. "We dine at 7:30. Tea is brought to the blue drawing-room at 4 unless people are pretending to rest and would rather come down late for gossip. Dr. Harbury may call, because he is making a ceremony of welcoming newcomers, though I do advise not discussing ailments with him unless you have set aside the afternoon. You make him sound harmless." "Oh, he is harmless now," said Mrs. Price, and immediately altered the phrase. "That is to say, he means well. Only people who have long been obeyed cannot bear retirement with quite the grace they imagine." She crossed to the window, looked down toward the lavender terraces, and, without seeming to think about it, touched the cream ribbon fastening the inner curtain tie-back. Clara noticed then that it was tied in exactly the same narrow, practical knot as those hanging in the pantry window. When Mrs. Price had gone, Clara stood still in the middle of the room. Somewhere in the house a door shut softly. Somewhere else there came 3 measured taps, as of a walking stick crossing tiles. Then, from the glazed corridor joining the 2 wings, there passed a shadow, no more than the outline of a woman moving behind patterned glass, and with it came, sharp and sudden, the smell of fresh lavender. Not old and dusty, but newly bruised, as if a hand had crushed the stems that very moment. Clara told herself it was one of the residents crossing to the library. She told herself, too, that the house had once been a place of treatment and routine, and that old buildings repeat themselves in sound as old people repeat themselves in speech. But when she went to the window and looked down, she saw Miss Marple in the garden below, standing motionless beside the second terrace wall, with her face lifted toward the glass corridor. She was not smiling now. She was simply watching, and after a moment she took out a pencil and wrote something on the back of an envelope. Chapter 2. What the House Allowed. By 4:30, Clara had decided that Ravenscroft House possessed the unnerving quality of making one feel both observed and gently managed, which she supposed was the natural inheritance of buildings that had once been devoted to recovery. The corridors were too wide for a private residence, and yet too narrow, in certain turns, for anonymity. At intervals there remained small brass plates beside doors whose original purposes had not quite been rubbed out by repainting. Consulting room, linen, electric treatment. One had been removed, but the shape of the plate persisted on the wall in a paler square, as if the house remembered even what people preferred to forget. She went down to tea, determined to look neither timid nor impressionable. A school headmistress who had dealt with fevers, scandals, parents, and one regrettable incident involving a canary in the Latin classroom did not, she told herself, lose composure because of shadows in corridor glass. Yet when she reached the blue drawing-room she was conscious, rather absurdly, of the smell of lavender again. Not strong, only present, threaded through the scent of tea and coal ash and the faint sourness of old upholstery left too near windows in winter. The drawing-room had been meant for display, but time had made it more intimate. The blue on the walls had gone smoky at the edges, and the gilt frames over the mantel showed a fine black stippling where the metal had fretted. A fire burned with a respectable rather than enthusiastic glow. Tea things stood on a low table near the window, and around them, in chairs of varying comfort, sat the household. Mrs. Price presided beside the tray, pouring with a steady hand. The retired solicitor, Mr. Basil Crewe, had an upper lip that seemed to object to almost everything, and pince-nez which he polished before making points nobody had invited. Near the fire lounged Mr. Ambrose Vale, the pianist, a long, elegant ruin of a man with silver hair brushed too carefully and a scarf knotted, in a manner that announced old habits of applause. On a sofa beneath a faded landscape sat the Fenwick sisters, one in mauve, one in brown, each turned a degree away from the other without for a moment ceasing to listen, and at the far side, by the bookshelves, Dr. Lionel Harbury himself stood speaking to Miss Marple. He was a tall man still, though age had hollowed him a little at the cheeks, and drawn the skin tightly about the temples. His hair, white and abundant, gave him an authority he had perhaps not entirely earned. The most striking thing about him was his manner. It was composed of perfect attentiveness, laid over fatigue, like a coverlet smoothed over an untidy bed. When Clara entered, he came toward her at once. "Miss Whitcomb, welcome. It is a selfish pleasure to see new people arrive here. One begins, after a while, to know too well the shape of everyone else's ailments and opinions. It freshens the atmosphere to have a stranger who has not yet chosen a grievance." His smile was practised but not empty. Clara, who mistrusted charm on principle but accepted that civilized life depended upon it, answered that she hoped not to disappoint him too quickly. "Oh, disappointment never arrives quickly," he said. "It is one of the few things in life with a proper sense of timing. Pray, sit down. Eleanor, Miss Whitcomb takes lemon, I think. She has the look of a woman who distrusts milk in tea." "I distrust assumptions rather more," said Clara, but lightly. "Quite right," said Dr. Harbury, as though rewarding a patient for spirit. "Still, one must observe, it is all we ever truly have." Miss Marple, from behind him, looked as if she might have found that remark amusing for reasons of her own. Tea began. The room adjusted itself around Clara with the slightly theatrical cordiality of long-established communities receiving a newcomer. Mr. Crewe asked whether she intended to read the newspapers regularly, since he had found that people who neglected them drifted into opinion. Mr. Vale inquired whether she played anything, and looked relieved when she said she did not. Miss Julia Fenwick in mauve asked if Clara had brought a maid, and her sister Agnes in brown said at once that of course she had not, because one never could tell these days whom to trust with drawers. Mrs. Price moved from cup to cup with soft competence, remembering who liked hot water, and who wanted the crust taken off the bread and butter. What Clara noticed, because school administration had trained her better than she knew, was that everyone deferred to Mrs. Price without appearing to. Cups reached her before requests were spoken. Small domestic uncertainties drifted toward her and were corrected. A shawl was found. A window was shut by an inch. A spoon was replaced. It was not the authority of position. It was the authority of being necessary. And Dr. Harbury, for all his social ease, watched her. Not romantically, not aggressively. Medically, Clara thought, with a private inward wince. He looked at people as though he could not help taking their measure against some inward chart of strength, weakness, resilience, decline. "Miss Whitcomb has only just arrived," said Mrs. Price, on handing her a plate. "You must not interrogate her as though she had come for examination. My dear Eleanor, it is very bad practice to delay one's first impressions," said Dr. Harbury. "After that, people begin acting." "A very depressing view," said Miss Marple. She was buttering toast with great care, as elderly ladies do when they are thinking of something else entirely, though I suppose there is a certain truth in it. In St. Mary Mead there was a churchwarden named Leonard Pike who always removed his hat before speaking to women. Everybody thought he was the soul of courtesy, but he only did it when he wished to distract them from whatever he had in his other hand, usually a subscription list. Once, quite remarkably, a silver christening mug. Mr. Vale laughed too loudly. "My dear Miss Marple, you reduce the whole of civilization to sleight of hand." "Oh, not the whole of it," she said, "only the social parts." The talk wandered then, as tea talk does, to weather, servants, the absurdity of modern train timetables, and whether bath chairs ought ever to be upholstered in floral fabric. Yet beneath it Clara sensed eddies. Mr. Crewe and Dr. Harbury fenced with old familiarity. The Fenwick sisters interrupted one another with the ease of women whose injuries had gone polished by use. Mr. Vale complained of draughts while placing himself in them, and once, when Mrs. Price bent to pass the tea cakes, Clara saw Dr. Harbury's expression is altered. Not desire, not affection, not irritation, but something closer to wary dependence. It vanished at once, but she had seen it. After tea, Miss Marple asked whether Clara would care to walk a little before dressing for dinner. The invitation was framed so modestly that refusal would have seemed unkind. They went out by the south door and into the terraced garden, where the lavender lay in clipped mounds along the paths, silvered at the edges by the failing light. "It is a very curious place," Clara said when they were beyond earshot of the windows. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Institutions converted into homes usually are. One cannot quite persuade the walls to forget their first purpose. Rather, as with certain people, They change clothes, habits, addresses, even names on occasion, but they remain arranged inwardly for the life they first made. Clara glanced sideways. You speak as if you knew a number of such people. My dear, villages are full of them. There was once in St. Mary Mead a woman called Mrs. Lethbridge, not her original name, though one was not supposed to know that, who became the most respectable person in the parish after arriving with 3 trunks and a nerve. She did it perfectly, only she continued, in the privacy of her kitchen, to count money twice before putting it away, which was the habit of a very different life. That sort of thing is so revealing. They had come by then to the lower terrace. From there the glass corridor linking the 2 wings of the house could be seen clearly, raised a little above the garden on stone arches. Its panes, some plain and some rippled, held the fading sky in broken strips of grey-blue light. The place ought to have looked merely functional. Instead, it had the peculiar theatricality of an enclosed bridge in an old dream. I saw someone there earlier, Clara said. Or thought I did. Miss Marple stooped to touch one of the lavender bushes. She rubbed a stem between finger and thumb, then lifted it to her nose. One often sees what is there, she said, but not when it matters. That is the trouble. Do you think I imagined it? I think, said Miss Marple, that houses permit certain impressions more readily than others, and people do the same. She began walking again. Clara had the sharp sense that the older woman knew something and would not yet say it, yet Miss Marple's face remained perfectly mild. They passed the lower gate, which opened toward a narrow lane running behind the property wall. The stone beside the latch had been worn smooth by long use. Below it, almost hidden by the shadow of the wall, Clara noticed something pale. She bent and lifted it. It was a narrow length of cream ribbon, neatly folded once and damp at one end, as though it had lain in the soil since morning. How odd, she said. Miss Marple looked at it without surprise. Not odd at all, perhaps. Only displaced. It matches the ribbons in the pantry. Yes, said Miss Marple. And the curtain tie in your room, I expect. Clara stared at her. How could you know that? My dear, one notices households by the way they repeat themselves. It is one of the few luxuries of age. From above them came the sound of footsteps in the glass corridor. Both women looked up at once. A figure moved across the frosted panes, broad-shouldered, unmistakably a man this time. Halfway across he stopped. There was the briefest pause, then the figure raised one arm as though resting a hand against the glass. A moment later Dr. Harbury emerged at the far end by the old treatment wing and vanished indoors. Miss Marple's gaze remained on the corridor. He does not like crossing it after dark, she said quietly. Clara turned. Who told you that? No one. But he walked very quickly in the middle and slowly at the end, which is what people do when they are ashamed of having hurried. They returned to the house as the lamps were being lit in the lower rooms. In the entrance hall, Mrs. Price stood on a chair adjusting the flowers beneath the mirror, her movements deft and economical. She climbed down when she saw them. I do hope you have not ventured to the bottom gate, she said. The stone is treacherous there after dusk and mister. Vale nearly went over last month because he insists on shoes meant for admiration rather than walking. We were perfectly safe, said Clara. Good. I should hate anything unpleasant that happens on the first day. New arrivals ought to have at least 48 hours of illusion before reality begins nibbling. She smiled as she said it. Yet Clara, looking at her, thought suddenly of the cream ribbon in her hand and the way Mrs. Price's fingers always seemed to be tying, straightening, adjusting. And because the thought had come uninvited, she distrusted it. At dinner, Dr. Harbury was charming. Mr. Crewe was intolerant. Mr. Vale drank more claret than was wise. The Fenwick sisters quarrelled over asparagus with such refinement that it almost became an art. Miss Marple spoke little, though once she observed that people often reveal their history not by what they collect, but by what they cannot bear to throw away. Mrs. Price dropped a spoon at that very moment, and the sound rang on the dining-room floor more sharply than it should have done. Later, when Clara had undressed and was brushing out her hair before the mirror, she heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a soft, repeated sound from somewhere beyond the wall. Not quite tapping, not quite scraping, a rhythm. Pull, tighten, release. Pull, tighten, release. She opened her bedroom door. The corridor was empty. At the far end, by the turn that led toward the glass passage, the house smelled powerfully, unmistakably, of fresh-cut lavender. And on the floor, lying in the centre of the runner as if set there by an orderly hand, was another cream ribbon tied into a perfect, practical bow. Chapter 3. Everything that was arranged. Clara did not immediately pick up the ribbon. There are moments when instinct, which is often nothing more than the accumulation of small remembered warnings, suggests that touching a thing will place one further inside whatever meaning it carries. She stood instead in the corridor, hair unpinned and falling in a heavy line down her back, looking at the bow as one might look at an answer one has not yet chosen to read. The gaslight at that end of the passage had a faint irregular flutter. as though the flame could not quite decide upon its shape. The runner beneath the ribbon showed the worn path of years, a narrow paler line where countless feet had followed the same route from the bedrooms toward the glass corridor. The bow lay precisely across that line, centered, deliberate, neither dropped nor lost. Clara bent at last and lifted it. The fabric was cool, slightly damp at one edge, and carried that sharper scent of lavender she'd begun to associate not with the house at large, but with particular moments. The corridor at dusk, the pantry window, the garden below the terrace wall. It was not the stale sweetness of dried bundles. It was fresher, immediate. She straightened, the ribbon in her hand, and turned toward the bend. Beyond it lay the short stretch leading to the glass passage. She could see, through the open door at the far end, the faint reflection of her own figure in the pane, elongated, indistinct. For a moment she thought she saw movement behind it, something passing from right to left. But when she stepped forward, the reflection broke and reformed into nothing but herself. It was ridiculous to hesitate. She had never encouraged timidity in others. She would not cultivate it now. Clara walked to the doorway and stood at the threshold of the glass corridor. By day it might have been merely practical. At night it was another matter. The panes, some clear, some rippled, held the interior lamps in wavering duplications. The tiled floor, she saw now that it was indeed tiled, small white squares with a thin border of darker stone, reflected the light in broken patches. The air inside seemed cooler, as though it belonged less to the house and more to the old purpose of the place. She stepped in. The sound of her shoes altered at once, a light hollow echo that returned to her with a delay just long enough to be noticeable. Halfway across she stopped, without meaning to, precisely where she'd seen the figure pause earlier in the evening. The smell of lavender was stronger here. Clara turned her head slightly, as one does when listening for something that is not quite sound. There was nothing, and yet not silence exactly. Rather the absence of ordinary domestic noise. No distant voices, no clink of china, no murmur from the lower rooms. It was as if the corridor had been set aside from the rest of the house. She resumed walking, a little more quickly than before, and reached the far door. It opened onto the older treatment wing, now converted. A narrow passage ran to the right, lined with doors that bore small brass numbers instead of names. To the left, a broader corridor led toward what must once have been the hydrotherapy room. She could feel, even at a distance, the peculiar chill that rises from large tiled spaces. Clara stood uncertainly. She had no reason to be here, no business that required exploration, and yet the ribbon in her hand, and the repetition of that careful knot, and the presence of the scent precisely in these places suggested, if not intention, then pattern. A door opened behind her. She turned quickly. Mrs. Price stood in the doorway to the glass corridor, her cardigan now replaced by a darker shawl, her hair drawn more tightly back than before. "Miss Whitcomb," she said, and though her voice remained soft, there was something in it that held Clara more firmly than any raised tone might have done. "You will find that part of the house less comfortable at night. The heating is unreliable and the echoes can be quite misleading." "I was only looking," said Clara. "I found this in the corridor." She held up the ribbon. Mrs. Price's gaze rested on it for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled. "Ah, one of mine, no doubt. I am forever misplacing things when I carry them about with me. It is a foolish habit. One begins to think one can manage everything at once, and of course one cannot." She stepped forward, taking the ribbon from Clara's hand with a small, efficient movement. "Thank you. You must not trouble yourself with household trifles. We are very well supplied with small inconveniences without borrowing more." There was nothing in the words to object to, yet Clara felt quite distinctly that she had been removed from a position she had not known she occupied. "You tie them very neatly," she said, because the observation had come to her and she did not care to suppress it. "Mrs. Price inclined her head. "One learns, in places like this, that neatness saves time later. Disorder has a way of multiplying when unattended. It is kinder to oneself to keep ahead of it." She turned slightly, as if to lead the way back. "Come," she said. "It grows late, and the house is apt to play tricks on those who are not yet accustomed to its habits." Clara followed her into the glass corridor again. This time she did not pause in the middle. At the entrance hall, Miss Marple sat in the same chair as before, though the knitting had been replaced by a small book. She looked up as they approached. "My dear Eleanor, you have been rescuing Miss Whitcomb already," she said. "That is very kind, though I cannot help thinking that rescue is sometimes a matter of timing. One must allow people a little space to be mistaken before setting them right. Otherwise they never learn the useful parts." Mrs. Price's smile remained composed. "I should not dream of depriving anyone of useful mistakes," she said. "Only unnecessary discomfort." She passed on toward the back of the house, the ribbon now no longer visible. Miss Marple closed her book and looked at Clara. "You have been exploring," she said. "I had not meant to," Clara replied. "It seemed natural." "Yes, houses encourage that. particularly those that have been repurposed. They contain layers, you see, and one feels, without quite knowing why, that one has not yet reached the original. Clara sat down. I found another ribbon. Mrs. Price said it was hers. I expect it is, said Miss Marple. She has the sort of mind that keeps track of small things, though even such minds, if they are very busy, may occasionally allow a detail to escape. Clara hesitated. There is something else, she said. The smell. It is not everywhere, only in certain places, and stronger at certain times. Miss Marple nodded slightly. That is often the case with things that are repeated, she said. They become attached to particular moments. In St. Mary Mead there was a man who had once been a baker. He left the trade and became a postman, but every morning at precisely 6:30 he would find himself at his old shop door, quite without intending it. Habits, you know, do not always consult the present before reasserting themselves. You think this is a habit? My dear, I think very little until I have enough to think about. But I will observe. She rose, smoothing her skirt. You will sleep, I hope. First nights are often restless, but restlessness is sometimes more instructive than sleep. One notices what returns. Clara wished her good night and went upstairs. In her room the air felt different, warmer, less insistent. She closed the door and stood for a moment listening. The faint sounds of the house had resumed. A distant cough, the creak of a floorboard, the muted closing of a door. She undressed and got into bed, extinguishing the lamp. For a while she lay awake, watching the dim outline of the window. The lavender bushes below formed darker shapes against the paler ground. Somewhere a clock struck 10, each note clear and separate. She was on the edge of sleep when it came again. Not footsteps this time. A movement, not outside, inside the house. A slow, measured passing along the glass corridor. She could hear it now even from her room, the altered echo of shoes on tile. Step, pause, step. Halfway across the sound stopped. Clara held her breath without meaning to. Then, very faintly, the sound of something being pulled tight, a soft, practiced motion, followed by the almost inaudible whisper of fabric released. Pull, tighten, release. The pattern repeated once more. Then the steps resumed, quicker now, as though the person crossing had remembered something and wished to be done with the journey. Clara turned her face into the pillow and closed her eyes. In the morning, she told herself, everything would appear ordinary again. Yet even as she thought it, she knew that something in the house did not belong to the present at all, and that whatever moved through the glass corridor at night was not merely passing from one room to another, it was repeating something it could not stop doing. Chapter 4. A very reasonable explanation. Clara woke with the distinct impression that she had been listening long after the sounds themselves had ceased. The room held that peculiar stillness of morning in an unfamiliar place, where even ordinary objects appear to be waiting for instruction. The rosemary on the dressing table had dried slightly at the tips overnight, curling inward as though reconsidering its own usefulness. The curtain tie, secured with the same narrow, efficient knot, remained perfectly in place. She rose, dressed, and rang for hot water, though she did not require it. Habit, she thought. One must not abandon all habits at once, or one risks becoming shapeless. At breakfast, the household gathered in a more practical arrangement than at tea. The room, which must once have served as a treatment ward, had been softened with rugs and sideboards, though the high windows admitted a light that remained stubbornly institutional. A long table stood in the centre, laid with eggs, toast, preserves, and a coffee pot that appeared to have been chosen for its durability rather than its charm. Mrs. Price moved quietly between places, adjusting plates, refilling cups, ensuring that everything proceeded with the kind of smoothness that discouraged comment. Dr. Harbury sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper with the attentive impatience of a man who expected to find something disagreeable and was prepared to be justified. Miss Whitcomb, he said without looking up, I trust the night was tolerable. The house makes a number of noises, none of which signify anything of interest, though people are inclined to assign meaning where none exists. I slept eventually, Clara replied. That is the correct approach, he said. One must not engage with disturbances that lack clinical basis. The imagination is a very untidy instrument. Miss Marple, seated to Clara's left, spread marmalade with a precision that suggested she was thinking of something else entirely. I have always found, she said gently, that the imagination is often tidier than reality. It arranges things into patterns that may not be correct, of course, but they are rarely without purpose. Reality, on the other hand, is inclined to leave its threads quite loose. Dr. Harbury lowered the paper. My dear Miss Marple, that is a charming observation, but one that has led many people into unnecessary distress. I have spent a lifetime persuading patients not to invent causes for their symptoms. And did they stop inventing them? She asked. He smiled, though not entirely with amusement. They did not improve the symptoms by doing so. Perhaps not, she said, though they may have understood them better. The exchange might have been nothing more than polite disagreement, yet Clara noticed that Mrs. Price, passing behind Dr. Harbury's chair, slowed for a fraction of a second, as though listening more closely than the words required. Conversation turned, as breakfast conversations do, to small practicalities. Mr. Crewe complained about the post, which he insisted had grown unreliable since the introduction of new sorting methods. Mr. Vale described a letter from an old acquaintance in Vienna with such detail that it became clear he valued the memory of the acquaintance more than the letter itself. The Fenwick sisters discussed a hat that had been seen in town, each describing it differently and each correcting the other with increasing precision. Clara ate and listened. What she noticed, because she had been trained to notice, was that Mrs. Price tied nothing at the table. Her hands moved constantly, pouring, lifting, placing, but they did not perform the small habitual gesture of adjusting ribbon, securing a knot or straightening a fastening. It was as though that particular action belonged to a different part of the house, or a different time of day. After breakfast, Miss Marple suggested a walk to the upper terrace, where the view extended over the slope of Lavender Hill and down toward the clustered roofs below. Clara agreed readily. The garden in daylight appeared less suggestive, though no less deliberate. The lavender bushes formed low, disciplined rows, their scent gentler now, almost apologetic. The gravel paths had been swept recently, the marks of the rake still visible in parallel lines. At intervals stood iron arches, bare of climbing plants, their purpose remembered but not fulfilled. "It is very well kept," Clara said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is always interesting. Places that are well kept without being loved have a particular character. They are maintained rather than inhabited. You think this is such a place?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it has been arranged very carefully. And arrangements, you know, yes, have a way of revealing the person who makes them." They paused near the second terrace wall. From here the glass corridor was clearly visible, its panes reflecting the pale morning light. A maid, one of the few younger people in the house, crossed from one end to the other carrying a tray. She did not pause in the middle. "Not everyone stops there," Clara observed. "No," said Miss Marple. "Only those who have reason." Clara hesitated. "I heard something last night," she said. "Not footsteps. Something else. A repeated motion." Miss Marple looked at her with interest, not alarm. "Did it have a rhythm?" "Yes." "Then it was almost certainly deliberate," she said. "Unintentional sounds rarely arrange themselves so neatly." Clara considered that. "You think someone is doing it on purpose?" "My dear, people do many things on purpose without acknowledging it, even to themselves. There was once, in St. Mary Mead, a woman named Mrs. Ellerton who rearranged her furniture every Sunday afternoon. She insisted it was for variety. In fact, she was attempting, quite unconsciously, to recreate the arrangement of a room she had left many years before. It never quite satisfied her, because the present cannot perfectly imitate the past, but she continued nonetheless. And no one told her? "Oh, several people told her a great many things," said Miss Marple, none of which altered the habit. They resumed walking. At the far end of the terrace, near the steps leading down to the lower gate, they encountered Mrs. Price. She was standing beside one of the lavender rows, holding a small pair of scissors and a basket containing freshly cut stems. The scent around her was stronger than anywhere else in the garden. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you slept well, Miss Whitcomb." "I did, thank you." Mrs. Price lifted a handful of stems, examining them with care before placing them in the basket. "The garden requires attention at this time of year," she said. "If one leaves it unattended, it becomes untidy very quickly, and untidiness in a place like this spreads." She spoke the word as though it had weight. "You are very diligent," Clara said. "One must be," Mrs. Price replied. "Otherwise things are forgotten." Miss Marple bent to touch a lavender bush as she had the day before. "It is curious," she said, "how certain scents become attached to particular moments. One smells them again, quite unexpectedly, and is taken back at once. It can be very inconvenient." Mrs. Price's hand tightened slightly on the stems. "Yes," she said, "very inconvenient." There was a pause, not empty, but occupied by something unspoken. Then Mrs. Price smiled. "I must not keep you," she said. "There is always more to be done than one expects." She turned and walked back toward the house, the basket balanced neatly on her arm. Clara watched her go. "There is nothing unreasonable about any of this," she said after a moment. "Ribbons, lavender, habits, it all has an explanation." "Of course it does," said Miss Marple. "Everything does. The difficulty lies in deciding whether the explanation we are given is the true one, or merely the convenient one." Clara looked again at the glass corridor. "And how does one tell the difference?" Miss Marple smiled, not unkindly. "One waits," she said, "and watches what repeats itself." They stood in silence for a while longer. Then, from the direction of the house, there came a sudden, sharp sound. Not loud, but distinct. The sound of something falling, followed by the unmistakable shatter of porcelain against tile. Both women turned at once. "That," said Miss Marple, "is not a repetition," and she began without haste to walk back toward the house. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Poured. Too carefully. The sound had come from the treatment wing. That much was clear even before they reached the entrance hall. The quality of it, the sharp break, the slight echo that followed, belonged to tiled spaces, not carpeted rooms. Clara, who had learned to identify disturbances by sound alone in a school full of girls who believed accidents were most convincing when left unexplained, felt a curious tightening of attention rather than alarm. Mrs. Price was already there when they arrived. She stood just inside the glass corridor, a fragment of white porcelain at her feet, her hands held very still before her, as though they had been interrupted in the act of doing something precise. A tray lay overturned beside her. One cup had shattered completely. Another remained intact but had rolled to the edge of the tiles and come to rest against the base of the door frame. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said at once, and the words came smoothly, almost too smoothly. "I was bringing tea for Mr. Vale. He insists on taking it in his room at this hour, and I suppose I misjudged the tray." Dr. Harbury appeared from the far corridor, his expression sharpened into professional concern. "What has happened?" "Nothing of consequence, Mrs." Price replied. "A dropped tray. It's entirely my fault." He stepped forward, bending slightly to examine the fragments. "You must not carry too much at once," he said. "It is a common error. One assumes one can manage everything and the body objects." "I assure you," she said, and now there was the faintest edge beneath the softness, "that my body has not yet begun objecting to domestic responsibilities." Miss Marple, who had remained just behind Clara, moved forward then, not to the centre of the scene but to one side of it, where she could observe without appearing to do so. "My dear Mrs. Price," she said, "one must never apologise for broken china. It has a way of relieving the tension in a house, I always think. In St. Mary Mead there was a vicar's wife who dropped something every time she was anxious about a parish meeting. It became quite a reliable indicator, though she would have been very surprised to hear it." Mrs. Price smiled, though her hands had not yet resumed their natural movement. "I am not anxious," she said. "No, of course not," said Miss Marple gently. "Only busy." Clara bent to pick up the unbroken cup. It was still warm. The tea inside had not spilled entirely, though a thin line had run down the side and pooled on the tile. She noticed, without intending to, that the handle had been turned inward on the tray, not outward, as one might expect when serving another person. It was a small detail, but one that suggested the tray had been arranged with care, perhaps even habit, before being lifted. "Let me help," she said. Mrs. Price reached out quickly. "No, please. I should not trouble you with this." The speed of the gesture was at odds with the calmness of her voice. "It is no trouble," Clara replied, placing the cup back on the tray. "One does not stand idle in the presence of broken things." For a moment their hands touched. Mrs. Price's fingers were cool, not cold, controlled. "Very well," she said. "Thank you." Together they gathered the larger fragments, placing them carefully on the tray. The smaller pieces were left for a maid, who had appeared silently from somewhere behind the corridor, and now knelt with a cloth and brush. As they worked, Clara became aware of the scent again, stronger now, not drifting, concentrated. It came not from the garden, nor from the pantry, but from the corridor itself, from the very place where Mrs. Price stood. She glanced down. At the edge of the tray, caught beneath the handle of the intact cup, was a narrow length of cream ribbon. It had not been there before. Clara was certain of it. She said nothing. Mrs. Price lifted the tray once more, this time with only one cup remaining. "I shall take this up again," she said. "Mr. Vale will be most put out if his tea is delayed, and one must not encourage artistic temperaments in their inconveniences." She turned and walked toward the stairs, her movements once again composed, efficient, unhurried. Clara watched her go. "She did not drop that by accident," she said quietly. Miss Marple, who had been examining the floor with mild interest, straightened. "My dear," she said, "very few things are dropped by accident. They are either released or they are allowed to fall. That is not the same thing." "No," said Miss Marple, "it is not, Doctor." Harbury, who had remained standing near the doorway, looked at them both with a faint expression of impatience. "I trust we're not about to construct a narrative around a broken cup," he said. "It is a most unproductive habit. One sees it in convalescent patients who have too much time and too little occupation. And yet," said Miss Marple, "narratives do tend to construct themselves given sufficient repetition." He dismissed this with a slight movement of the hand. "I prefer facts." "As do I," she said, "though facts have a way of arranging themselves into patterns, whether one approves or not." He turned away, clearly uninterested in pursuing the matter further. Clara followed Miss Marple back into the entrance hall. "You saw it," she said. "The ribbon?" Miss Marple replied. "Yes. It was not there before." "No," said Miss Marple. "It was not," Clara frowned. "Then how did it come to be under the cup?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "There are several possibilities," she said. "One might suppose it had been there all along and was merely overlooked. or that it was placed there deliberately, or that it fell in a manner that appears deliberate. That is not helpful. My dear, helpfulness is often a matter of timing. At present, we have only the beginning of a pattern. It would be premature to decide its meaning. Clara walked to the hall table and stood for a moment, looking at the arrangement of flowers. The camellias had been replaced. In their place stood a fresh bowl, uncracked, unmarked, filled with lavender stems tied in neat bundles, each secured with the same narrow cream ribbon. She turned. Those were not there before? No, said Miss Marple, they were not. Mrs. Price reappeared a few minutes later, empty tray in hand. I do hope everything has been put to rights, she said. I dislike leaving things unfinished. It has, Clara replied. Mrs. Price glanced at the table. Ah, she said. I thought the hall might benefit from something fresher. She moved to adjust one of the bundles, her fingers tightening the ribbon with a small, practiced motion. Lavender has a way of making a place feel settled, she said. Miss Marple watched her. Yes, she said softly, it does. There was something in her tone that Clara could not quite interpret. Not agreement, not disagreement, recognition perhaps. Mrs. Price stepped back, surveying the arrangement with quiet satisfaction. There, she said. That is better. She turned to them both, her expression once again composed. I must attend to the rest of the house. There is always more to be done than one expects. She left the room without further comment. Clara remained where she was, looking at the lavender bundles. Each one is identical, each one tied with the same careful knot. She is repeating something, she said. Yes, said Miss Marple. But what? Miss Marple folded her hands lightly before her. That, she said, is what we must discover. Clara looked again at the table. The scent of lavender was now unmistakable, not unpleasant, not overwhelming, but present, persistent, as though the house itself had begun to remember something it could not quite forget. And as she stood there, watching the ribbons that held each bundle in place, Clara had the distinct and unsettling impression that whatever was being repeated was not finished yet. Chapter 6. What was left unsaid. By mid-afternoon, the house had resumed its ordinary rhythm, though Clara found that ordinary now contained a certain awareness, as if she had been given a second way of seeing that could not easily be put aside. People moved, spoke, and behaved exactly as before, yet each action seemed to carry a faint echo of intention beneath it. It was not suspicion precisely. Clara disliked that word. Suspicion was untidy, speculative. What she felt instead was attention. She spent part of the afternoon in the small library off the treatment wing, the one Mrs. Price had described as being used only in winter. It was a narrow room lined with mismatched shelves, the books arranged more by size than subject, as though they had been placed there to fill space rather than to be read. A single window looked out toward the back lane, and beneath it stood a writing desk with a leather surface, worn to a dull softness by years of use. Clara did not read. Instead, she observed, there were marks on the desk, not scratches, but faint indentations, as though someone had written there with considerable pressure, the sort of pressure one applies when copying something rather than composing it. She ran her fingers lightly across the surface, feeling the slight ridges beneath the leather. Copying. The thought came uninvited, and she did not yet know why. From the corridor beyond came the familiar altered sound of footsteps on tile. Not hurried, not slow, measured. Clara did not turn immediately. Instead, she waited. The steps entered the glass corridor. She counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. A pause. Then the faint sound, unmistakable now, of fabric being drawn tight. Pull, tighten, release. The steps resumed, quicker now. Clara rose and went to the door. The corridor was empty. She stepped into the glass passage, her gaze moving instinctively to the middle. Nothing. And yet, something had been there. Not visible, but present in the arrangement of the air, the way one knows a chair has been moved even after it has been returned to its place. She crossed to the far side and stood for a moment listening. No further sound came, only the distant murmur of voices from the drawing room and the faint clink of china being arranged somewhere below. Clara turned back. At the exact point where she had heard the pause, she saw it. Not a ribbon this time, a mark, on the tile. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a thin, darker line across one of the white squares, as though something had been dragged lightly across it again and again. Not recently, repeatedly. She knelt, touching it with her fingertips. It did not come away. It had been made over time. A habit. Clara straightened slowly. Ah, said a voice behind her. You have found it. She turned. Miss Marple stood at the entrance to the corridor, her expression one of mild interest rather than surprise. It is not very noticeable, Clara said, unless one is looking for it. Yes, said Miss Marple. That is generally the case with such things. Clara gestured toward the mark. It is made by repetition, undoubtedly, and always in the same place. "Which suggests," said Miss Marple, "that the action which caused it is also performed in the same place." Clara considered this. "The pause," she said. "It always happens here." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "You're observing very well, Miss Whitcomb. It is a most useful habit, though not always a comfortable one." Clara remained standing, looking down at the mark. What sort of action would leave such a trace? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly into the corridor, stopping beside the mark. She looked down at it, then up at the glass panes, then back at Clara. "There was a woman in St. Mary Mead," she said, "who had a habit of tying and untying the ribbon of her apron whenever she was thinking. She did it without noticing, and it left a curious polish on the edge of her kitchen table, where the ribbon would brush against it. We all assumed it was a nervous habit. It was not, of course. It was a way of remembering. Remembering what? Something she did not wish to forget," said Miss Marple. Clara felt a small, precise shift in her understanding. "This is not accidental," she said. "No, and it is not recent. No, then whoever is doing it has been doing it for some time," Miss Marple finished gently. Clara turned away, walking the length of the corridor once more. "Mrs. Price," she said. Miss Marple did not immediately agree. "She is the one who ties the ribbons," Clara continued. "The knots are identical. The placement is consistent, and the scent—" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The scent is particularly interesting." Clara stopped at the far end. "Then it must be her." Miss Marple smiled, though there was no amusement in it. "My dear Miss Whitcomb, one must be very careful with must. It is a word that closes possibilities rather too quickly. But the evidence suggests a pattern," said Miss Marple. "It does not yet tell us why." Clara exhaled slowly. "You are waiting." "Yes." "For what?" "For the pattern to complete itself," said Miss Marple. They returned to the entrance hall together. Mrs. Price stood at the table, rearranging the lavender bundles once more. She had removed 2 and replaced them with fresh stems, tying each with the same narrow ribbon, her fingers moving with quiet efficiency. "Ah," she said, looking up, "you've found the library. I hope it was not too cold." "It was quite comfortable," Clara replied. Mrs. Price adjusted one of the ribbons, pulling it tight with a small, practiced motion. "One does what one can," she said. "Though old buildings have their own ideas about comfort." Miss Marple watched her. "Yes," she said, "they do." There was a moment, brief but distinct, in which Mrs. Price's hands paused, not stopped, paused. Then they resumed. "I must see to the evening arrangements," she said. "Dinner requires more attention than one expects." She turned and left the room. Clara looked at Miss Marple. "She did it just now," she said. "The same motion." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And she does not realise she's doing it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That," she said, "is the most important question of all." Clara frowned. "You think she does not know?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that people are often aware of what they do, but not of why they do it. And sometimes the why is the more revealing part." Clara walked to the table, examining the bundles. Each ribbon was tied in the same way. Each knot is identical. Each stem is arranged with the same careful precision. "It's like copying," she said suddenly. Miss Marple looked at her with interest. "Copying?" "Yes, not creating. Repeating, as though she's trying to reproduce something exactly." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is a very perceptive distinction." Clara stepped back. "But what is she copying?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she looked toward the glass corridor, her gaze resting on the place where the pause always occurred. Then she said very quietly, "That is what the house remembers." Clara followed her gaze. The corridor stood empty, still, silent, and yet not empty at all, because something had been done there, again and again, until the very surface of the place had begun to hold it, and whatever that action was, it had not yet finished repeating itself. Chapter 7. What the doctor did not keep it. Was Dr. Harbury who suggested the walk. The proposal came at that delicate hour between late afternoon and dinner, when the house seemed to hesitate between its public and private selves. The lamps had not yet been lit, but the light outside had begun to lose its conviction. People moved more quietly then, as though conserving something for the evening. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, appearing at the doorway of the drawing-room with his newspaper folded under his arm. "You have not yet seen the upper path, I think. It runs behind the treatment wing and gives a rather instructive view of the property. One understands a place better when one sees how it fits together." Clara, who had been sitting with a book she had not turned a page of, looked up. "That sounds sensible," she said. Miss Marple, from her chair by the window, did not immediately speak, but Clara noticed that her knitting, returned now to her hands, had paused mid-row. "Miss Marple," Dr. Harbury added, with a slight inclination of the head that was almost respectful, "you may find the air agreeable, though I warn you, the path is uneven in places." "My dear doctor," said Miss Marple, "unevenness is often the most instructive part of a walk. I should be delighted." They went out by the side door, the one that led past the old treatment wing and into a narrower path bordered by low stone walls. Here the house revealed another aspect of itself, less composed, less arranged. The back of the building showed its alterations more plainly. Windows of different sizes. A door that had been bricked up. A drain pipe that ran at an angle suggesting it had been added as an afterthought. "This part was not meant to be seen," said Dr. Harbury, as though reading Clara's thoughts. "It is the service side, so to speak. Every institution has one. It is where the necessary things happen. And necessary things are rarely decorative," said Miss Marple. "Precisely," he replied. They walked in silence for a few moments. The path sloped gently upward, curving behind the glass corridor. From here, one could see its length from a different angle, not as a passage, but as a structure suspended between two parts of the house, neither entirely belonging to one nor the other. It was originally enclosed to protect patients," Dr. Harbury said. "Exposure to cold air was considered detrimental. One sees the same principle in older hospitals, the desire to control the environment entirely." "And did it succeed?" Clara asked. "In controlling the environment?" He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. In controlling people, less so." They reached a point where the path widened slightly, forming a small clearing. From here, the lower terraces were visible, along with the back lane and the gate Clara had noticed the day before. Dr. Harbury stopped. "You will observe," he said, "that the house is arranged in a manner that encourages movement along certain lines. Corridors, paths, terraces, all designed to guide behaviour. It is quite effective, though one must not become too conscious of it." "Because then one resists," Clara suggested. "Because then one becomes self-conscious," he corrected, "and that is always undesirable." Miss Marple bent to examine a small plant growing at the edge of the path. "It is curious," she said, "how people respond to such arrangements. Some follow them without question, others deviate at once simply to assert themselves, and a few, the most interesting ones, follow them so precisely that one begins to wonder why." Dr. Harbury glanced at her. "You speak as though it were a matter of character." "It always is," she said. There was a pause, not an empty one. Dr. Harbury looked out over the terraces, his expression thoughtful. "You have been observing the house," he said, not quite a question. "One always observes," said Miss Marple. "It is the only way to understand anything." "And what have you understood?" She smiled. "Very little. But I have noticed a few things." He waited. She did not elaborate. Clara felt, rather than saw, the shift in the conversation. It was subtle, but it was there. "You must forgive Miss Marple," Clara said lightly. "She prefers to let observations accumulate before committing to conclusions." "An admirable approach," said Dr. Harbury. "Though in my profession, one is often required to act before certainty is available." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that can be very dangerous." He turned to her. "Or very necessary." They held each other's gaze for a moment. Then Dr. Harbury smiled again, and the tension, if it had been tension, dissolved into something more ordinary. "Shall we continue?" he said. They walked on. The path curved back toward the house, descending slightly until it rejoined the main garden near the second terrace. As they approached, Clara noticed something she had not seen before. A door. It was set into the side of the treatment wing, partially obscured by the angle of the wall. The paint had been refreshed, but the hinges were older, darker, and showed signs of long use. "What is that?" she asked. Dr. Harbury followed her gaze. "That leads to the hydrotherapy room," he said. "It is no longer in use. The equipment was removed years ago, though the structure remains. May we see it?" He hesitated, only for a moment. "It is not particularly interesting," he said, "and the floor can be damp." "I would like to see it," said Miss Marple. There was something in her tone that made refusal difficult. Dr. Harbury inclined his head. "Very well." He stepped forward and opened the door. The air inside was cooler, not cold, but distinctly separate from the rest of the house. The room was larger than Clara had expected, high-ceilinged, with tiled walls and a floor that sloped gently toward a central drain. The tiles were white, though time had softened their brightness. Along one wall stood the remains of the old fixtures, pipes, brackets, the outline of where something larger had once been installed. It was empty, and yet not empty. The space held a presence, not of a person, but of use, repeated use. Clara stepped inside. Her shoes made the same hollow sound as in the glass corridor, though deeper, more resonant. "It is rather like a stage," she said. Dr. Harbury looked at her. "A stage?" "Yes, as though something had been performed here." He smiled faintly. "In a sense it was. Treatments, exercises, recovery routines, all very structured." Miss Marple moved slowly across the room, her gaze taking in the details. "Structured," she repeated. She stopped near the centre, then quite deliberately she turned and looked toward the door. Clara followed her gaze. From this position the door stood directly opposite, and beyond it, through a narrow alignment of space, one could see the entrance to the glass corridor. The same line, the same path, a direct connection. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. Dr. Harbury watched her. "Did you find something interesting?" "Only a possibility," she said. Clara felt a sudden clarity. "The movement," she said. "It is the same line, from here to the corridor. Dr. Harbury's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "You are constructing patterns again," he said. "Only observing them," said Miss Marple. He stepped forward, his tone now more definite. "This room has not been used in years. Whatever habits you imagine, they do not originate here." Miss Marple looked at him. "My dear doctor," she said, "habits do not require current use. They require repetition, and repetition, once established, has a way of continuing, even when the original purpose has been removed." There was silence then, not empty, but full. Clara sensed that something had been said, not in words, but in implication. Dr. Harbury turned away. "I think we have seen enough," he said. "The room serves no present function." He moved toward the door. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment longer. Then she said very quietly, "On the contrary." Clara looked at her. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the floor, on a point near the centre. Clara followed it. There, faint but unmistakable, was a mark. Not the same as in the corridor, but similar. A trace, left by something that had been done, more than once. Clara felt a slow, deliberate understanding begin to form. Not complete, not yet, but enough to be troubling. Miss Marple turned. "We must not keep the doctor waiting," she said. They left the room together. Dr. Harbury closed the door behind them, and as the latch settled into place, Clara had the distinct impression that whatever had once been done in that room had not been entirely left behind. It had simply moved, and was continuing elsewhere. Chapter 8. The Hour That Did Not Change. Dinner that evening was quieter than the night before, though no one remarked upon it. The change lay not in what was said, but in how it was said. A fraction more care, a hesitation before certain topics, a slight awareness of listening that had not been present previously. Clara, who had presided over enough staff meetings to recognise the atmosphere of unspoken adjustment, noted it without allowing herself to appear to do so. Mrs. Price moved, as she always did, efficiently, attentively, yet Clara observed that she no longer lingered in any one place for longer than necessary. Her presence, once a constant thread binding the room together, now seemed to pass through it in shorter intervals, as though she were careful not to be fixed in any single position. Dr. Harbury spoke more than usual. He described a case from his earlier career, not in detail, but with enough emphasis to establish his authority, and offered several observations on the decline of modern medical discipline. Mr. Crewe responded with equal firmness on the decline of legal standards. Mr. Vale contributed anecdotes that grew progressively more elaborate as the claret level diminished. The Fenwick sisters disagreed about everything, and yet aligned perfectly in their tone of mild disapproval. Miss Marple said very little. She ate slowly, listening. Clara found herself doing the same. It was not uncomfortable, not precisely, but something had shifted. The house, or the people within it, had become aware of something not yet defined. After dinner, as the others moved toward the drawing room, Miss Marple touched Clara's sleeve lightly. "My dear," she said, "I wonder if you would indulge an old woman in a small experiment." Clara turned. "Of course." Miss Marple glanced toward the clock on the mantel. It showed a few minutes past 9. "There is a particular hour at which certain things tend to occur," she said. "I would like to see whether that remains consistent." "You mean the corridor?" "Yes." Clara felt a faint tightening in her chest. "You think it will happen again?" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "it already has." She moved toward the entrance hall, her steps unhurried. Clara followed. They did not go directly to the glass corridor. Instead, Miss Marple positioned herself near the base of the stairs, where one could see both the entrance to the corridor and the passage leading toward the treatment wing. "We shall wait here," she said. "For how long?" "Until we have our answer." Clara glanced at the clock again. 9 minutes past 9. The house had settled into its evening pattern. Voices drifted faintly from the drawing room. A chair shifted somewhere above. The distant sound of a door closing carried briefly through the corridor. Nothing unusual, nothing distinct. Clara began to wonder whether the experiment would yield anything at all. Then, at precisely 9:15, it began. The sound came first. Footsteps, measured, regular, from the direction of the treatment wing. Clara felt the recognition before she consciously identified it. The same rhythm, the same pace. Step, step, step. Miss Marple did not move. She watched. The footsteps entered the glass corridor. Clara could not see the figure clearly from where they stood, only the movement behind the patterned panes, the shifting outline that passed from one end to the other. Halfway across, it stopped. Exactly as before. There was a pause, then the sound. Pull, tighten, release. Clara's breath caught. The motion was unmistakable now, not imagined, not inferred, heard. The steps resumed, quicker this time, as though the person crossing had completed something and wished to move on. The figure reached the far end and disappeared into the main wing. Silence followed. Not empty silence, but the kind that settles after something has occurred and leaves its shape behind. Clara turned to Miss Marple. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," Miss Marple replied. "It is always at the same time." "Yes." "The same movement. The same place." "Yes." Clara felt a growing certainty. "It is a routine." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Exactly," Clara frowned. "But why?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the corridor, her gaze thoughtful. "In St. Mary Mead," she said at last, "there was a man who wound the church clock every evening at precisely the same hour. He had done it for years. When he fell ill and could no longer perform the task, he became quite distressed, not because the clock would stop, but because the act itself had become necessary to him. It was no longer a duty, it was a reassurance." Clara considered this. "You think this is the same?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that repetition often serves a purpose beyond the obvious one. It may begin as a necessity, it may become a habit, and sometimes it becomes something else entirely." Clara looked again at the corridor. "But this is not winding a clock." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "it is not." They stood in silence for a moment longer, and then Clara said, "We must see who it is." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, we already know." Clara turned sharply. "You do?" Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "The possibilities are limited," she said. "The time is fixed. The movement is specific. The path is consistent. And the scent, the lavender," Clara said. "Yes." Clara felt the conclusion forming. "Mrs. Price." Miss Marple did not confirm it, nor did she deny it. Instead, she said, "There is something else we must consider." "What?" "The purpose." Clara exhaled. "You still think it is not simply a habit?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that habits of this kind rarely exist in isolation. They are connected to something, a memory, a moment, an action that has not been resolved." Clara looked at her. "Resolved?" "Yes." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple added, very quietly, "or perhaps not forgiven." Clara felt a chill, not from the air, but from the implication. "You think something happened?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that something is still happening." At that moment, a door opened behind them. Mrs. Price stepped into the hall. She looked composed, calm, entirely as she had before. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "you have slipped away from the drawing-room. I do hope you're not finding the evening dull." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "I was merely observing the house." Mrs. Price smiled. "It is not a particularly interesting house," she said. "It does not change." Miss Marple looked at her. "No," she said, "it does not." There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Price said, "I must attend to a few things before retiring. There is always something left unfinished." She turned and walked toward the back of the house. Clara watched her go. "She was not in the corridor," she said. "No," said Miss Marple. "Then it cannot be her." Miss Marple's smile returned, very faintly. "My dear," she said, "you are assuming that a person must be in one place at a time." Clara stared at her. "That is a very strange thing to say." "Is it?" Miss Marple replied gently. "Or is it merely an incomplete understanding?" Clara turned back toward the corridor. It stood empty now, still, unchanged, and yet not unchanged at all, because something had occurred there, again, at the same hour, in the same place, with the same deliberate motion, and whatever was being repeated had not yet revealed why. Chapter 9. The letter that did not belong. It was the desk that drew her back. Clara had not intended to return to the library so soon, yet after the evening's observation she found that certain places within the house had begun to hold a particular gravity, as though they were not merely locations but points of connection. The library, unused, overlooked, and faintly neglected, had the quality of a room that had once been important and had not entirely relinquished that role. She went there the following morning before breakfast. The house at that hour was not empty, but it was quieter in a different way, the quiet of preparation rather than rest. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed with careful economy. Water ran briefly through pipes that had long ago learned to complain. The faint scent of lavender lingered, but less insistently, as though it too observed a routine. The library window admitted a pale, uncertain light. Clara stood by the desk again. The indentations she had noticed the previous day were more visible now, the angled morning light revealing their pattern more clearly. They were not random. They formed lines, not words she could read, but the impression of words once written with enough force to mark the surface beneath. She placed her hand lightly over them. There was something deliberate in their arrangement, a sequence, not hurried, not careless, copied. The thought returned, stronger now. Clara opened the desk. It was not locked. Inside lay a small collection of items, nothing remarkable at first glance. A few loose sheets of paper, an envelope without a stamp, a pencil worn nearly to its end, and at the back, a folded letter. She hesitated, not out of propriety, though she possessed that in sufficient measure, but because she sensed quite distinctly that this was not an accidental discovery. The letter had been placed there, not hidden, not displayed, left. She unfolded it. The paper was of good quality, though slightly creased from handling. The handwriting was firm, controlled, the sort that reveals education without ornament. Clara read, "You must understand that I cannot continue in this manner. It is not a question of preference nor of convenience, but of necessity. What has been done cannot be undone, and it is no kindness to pretend otherwise. I have given this matter considerable thought, more perhaps than is wise, and I find that there is only one course that allows for any semblance of order. I will speak to you this evening at the usual time. You will not attempt to dissuade me. That would be unkind. LH." Clara read it twice, then a third time. The words were precise, controlled, and entirely without warmth. She folded the letter carefully and replaced it where she had found it. There was no doubt in her mind now. Dr. Lionel Harbury. The initials left no room for ambiguity. She closed the desk and stood still for a moment. "Ah," said Miss Marple's voice from the doorway. "You have found something." Clara turned. Miss Marple stood with her usual air of mild interest, as though she had arrived not to interrupt but to observe what had already occurred. "There is a letter," Clara said. "Yes. You knew." "My dear, I suspected there might be something of that nature. Rooms like this tend to accumulate unfinished conversations." Clara moved slightly aside, allowing Miss Marple to approach the desk. "It is from Dr. Harbury," she said. "To someone in the house?" Miss Marple nodded. "And it concerns something that cannot be undone," Clara continued. "Something that required a decision, a conversation." "At a particular time?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, this evening, at the usual time." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but Clara sensed a quiet confirmation. "The hour," she said. "Indeed." Clara felt a tightening of understanding. "The repetition," she said. "The corridor. The movement. It is not random. It is tied to that moment." "Yes." Clara looked at her. "Then this is not merely a habit?" "No," said Miss Marple. "It is a remembrance." Clara turned back to the desk. "But what happened?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the window, looking out toward the back lane. "In St. Mary Mead," she said after a moment, "there was a woman who received a letter every Thursday afternoon. It was always brief, always polite, and always unsatisfactory. She would read it, fold it, and place it in the same drawer. One day the letters stopped. She continued to go to the drawer every Thursday at the same hour and open it, as though expecting something to have changed. It never did." "That is very sad," Clara said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but not as sad as what had been written in the letters." Clara waited. Miss Marple turned back. "People often repeat actions when they cannot alter the outcome," she said. "It gives them the illusion of control." Clara thought of the corridor, the pause, the motion, pull, tighten, release. "She's not remembering the letter," Clara said slowly. "She's remembering what happened after it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That would seem likely," Clara exhaled. "And Dr. Harbury knows." "Yes, he must." "Yes." Clara felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "That is why he dismissed it," she said. "The sounds, the patterns. He does not wish them to be examined." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, people rarely wish their past to be examined, particularly when it has not behaved as they intended." Clara walked to the door. "We must speak to him." Miss Marple did not move. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because," said Miss Marple gently, "we do not yet know what we are asking." Clara stopped. "We know enough. We know that something was done," Miss Marple said. "We do not yet know by whom, or why, or with what consequence." Clara turned back. The letter tells us that a conversation was intended," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "It does not tell us how that conversation ended." There was a pause. Then Clara said, "You think it did not end well?" Miss Marple's expression grew very slightly more serious. "I think," she said, "that it did not end at all." Clara felt a chill. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked toward the glass corridor. "I mean that whatever happened at that hour has not yet finished happening." Clara followed her gaze. The corridor stood empty, unremarkable, still, and yet no longer innocent, because now there was context, a letter, a meeting, a time, and a repetition that had continued long after the original moment had passed. Clara turned back to Miss Marple. "We are missing something," she said. "Yes." "What?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "The most important part," she said, "and that is—" Miss Marple met her eyes. "Who did not leave that corridor?" Clara stared at her, and in that instant the pattern shifted. Not complete, not yet, but closer, because the repetition was not merely an action. It was an event, one that had begun and never properly ended. Chapter 10. The Thing That Was Not Finished. Clara did not go down to breakfast immediately. Instead, she remained in her room, standing at the window that overlooked the terraces, watching the lavender bushes as though they might rearrange themselves into something more intelligible if she gave them sufficient attention. The morning had come clear and pale, the kind of light that reveals edges without softening them. It was, she thought, a light in which things were less easily disguised. Below, the garden showed its usual order. Paths swept, rows aligned, nothing out of place. And yet, everything was, because now she knew that the arrangement itself was part of the pattern. She turned away at last and went downstairs. Breakfast proceeded as before, though Clara found it increasingly difficult to engage with the surface of conversation. Mr. Crewe spoke at length about a minor legal inconsistency he had discovered in a pamphlet. Mr. Vale described a musical passage that no one else had heard and therefore could not dispute. The Fenwick sisters disagreed about the proper way to store preserves. Dr. Harbury read his newspaper. Mrs. Price poured tea. Miss Marple spread marmalade. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Clara watched Dr. Harbury. He appeared entirely at ease. His manner was composed, his voice measured, his attention distributed with professional fairness among those present. There was no visible sign of strain, no hesitation, no indication that he carried within him any awareness of the letter Clara had read, or the pattern that now seemed so unmistakable. But Clara had begun to understand something. Control, when practiced long enough, becomes indistinguishable from nature. "Miss Whitcomb," he said suddenly, lowering the paper, "you seem thoughtful this morning. I trust the house is not proving too taxing." "On the contrary," she replied. "I find it increasingly instructive." He smiled. "In what respect?" Clara met his gaze. "In the way it preserves certain things," she said. There was a fraction of a pause. Then he said, "Preservation is not always desirable." "No," she said, "but it is often unavoidable." Miss Marple, beside her, took a sip of tea. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a gentleman who insisted on preserving every letter he had ever received. He kept them in boxes, arranged by year. He said it was a matter of record. In fact, it was a matter of avoidance. He preferred the written version of events to the remembered one." Dr. Harbury folded his newspaper. "Memory is notoriously unreliable," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "particularly when one has reason to prefer a different version. The exchange might have passed unnoticed by others, but Clara saw it. The slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, not enough to draw attention, enough to confirm. After breakfast, Clara found Miss Marple in the garden. She was standing near the second terrace wall, exactly where she had stood on the first day, her attention directed toward the glass corridor. "You have decided something," Miss Marple said, without turning. "Yes." Clara stepped beside her. "The letter," she said. "The time. The pattern. It all points to a meeting that took place in the corridor." "Yes." "And something happened during that meeting." "Yes." Clara exhaled. "But we still do not know what." Miss Marple bent to touch a lavender bush, rubbing a stem lightly between her fingers. "What do we know?" she asked. Clara considered. "We know that Dr. Harbury intended to speak to someone," she said, "at the usual time, and that time has continued to be observed." "Yes." "We know that the movement through the corridor follows a consistent pattern." "Yes." "And that the action performed in the middle is repeated." "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we must ask," she said. "What action would be significant enough to require repetition, and yet incomplete enough to continue?" Clara frowned. "That is not a simple question." "No," said Miss Marple, "but it is the correct one." Clara looked toward the corridor. "The motion," she said. "Pull, tighten, release." "Yes." "It is not random." "No." "It is deliberate." "Yes." Clara felt the answer approaching, though not yet fully formed. "A knot," she said suddenly. Miss Marple glanced at her. "Yes." "A ribbon," Clara continued. "Untied, retied." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Very good." Clara turned to her. "But why?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "In St. Mary Mead, there was a woman who tied her gloves very tightly before going out. Always the same way, always with the same care. It was not vanity, it was preparation. She believed that if the gloves were properly secured, nothing else would go wrong. Of course, things did go wrong, but she continued the practice." "That is superstition," Clara said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but superstition often grows from experience." Clara looked back at the corridor. "This is not superstition," she said. "It is something else." "Yes." "What?" Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "Completion." Clara felt a sudden sharp clarity. "The action was not finished," she said. "Yes." "And so it is repeated." "Yes." Clara turned to her. "But what action?" Miss Marple met her gaze, the one that was interrupted. Clara stood very still. Then she said, "We must go back to the room." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." They returned to the treatment wing. The door to the hydrotherapy room stood closed as before. Clara opened it. The air inside felt unchanged, cool, still, holding something. They stepped in. Clara moved to the centre of the room, to the place where she had seen the faint mark on the floor. She stood there. Then slowly she turned, facing the door, aligning herself with the corridor beyond. The same line, the same path. "The meeting began here," she said. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Clara took a step forward, then another. She walked toward the door, her pace measured, deliberate. She reached the threshold, stepped into the corridor, continued forward, into the glass passage. Her footsteps echoed softly on the tile. She reached the middle, stopped. The air felt different here, as though it held something, not visible but present. She stood very still. Then, almost without thinking, she raised her hands and mimicked the motion. Pull, tighten, release. The gesture felt oddly familiar, not to her, but to the place. She lowered her hands, and in that moment, the understanding came. Not complete, not yet, but enough. She turned to Miss Marple. It was not just a meeting, she said. No, said Miss Marple. It was a confrontation. Yes. Clara felt her breath steady, and something happened here. Yes. Clara looked down at the tile, at the faint mark, at the place where the action was repeated, and she said, "Someone did not leave this corridor." Miss Marple's expression was very gentle. "No," she said, "they did not." Clara looked up. "Then where did they go?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "That is the question Dr. Harbury does not wish us to ask." Clara turned toward the door, then back to Miss Marple. "We must ask for it," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "we must." And as they stood there in the exact place where the pattern repeated itself night after night, Clara understood one thing with complete certainty. Whatever had happened in that corridor had not ended. It had been interrupted, and until it was completed or understood, it would continue. Chapter 11. What the Tiles Remembered. Clara did not leave the corridor at once. There are moments when understanding arrives not as a conclusion but as a position, a place one must stand in order to see correctly. She remained where she was, at the precise center of the glass passage, her shoes resting on the faintly worn tile, her hands still holding the memory of the movement she had just imitated. Pull, tighten, release. The air felt thinner here, not colder, but altered. Miss Marple did not hurry her. She stood a little way off, near the entrance from the treatment wing, her posture relaxed, her attention exact. "My dear," she said at last, "one must be careful not to move too quickly at this stage. It is rather like untying a knot. If one pulls at the wrong thread, the whole thing tightens." Clara exhaled slowly. "It is already tight," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but it has been tied that way for some time. We must not assume it cannot be loosened." Clara looked down again at the tile. The mark was clearer now that she understood it. Not a single line, but a repeated abrasion, a slight roughening of the surface where something had brushed against it again and again. Not forcefully, persistently. She knelt. There was a second mark, fainter, parallel, not exactly the same position, slightly offset, as though the action had not always been performed in precisely the same place. Clara touched it. "It moved," she said. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Yes," she said. "That is very important." Clara rose. "It was not fixed at first," she said. "The position changed." "Yes." And then it became consistent. "Yes." Clara felt the implication settle. "It was learned." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Exactly." Clara turned slowly, looking along the length of the corridor. "The first time," she said, "it did not happen here." "No, it happened elsewhere." "Yes." "And then it was repeated here." "Yes." Clara's gaze shifted to the door of the treatment wing. "The room," she said. "Yes." Clara felt a tightening in her chest. "The action began there," she said, "and it continued here." Miss Marple did not speak. Clara walked back toward the treatment wing, her steps deliberate now, no longer exploratory but directed. She entered the hydrotherapy room. The air received her as before, cool, still, holding. She went to the center. The mark she'd seen earlier was no longer merely a trace. It was the beginning, fainter than the one in the corridor, less defined, but present. She turned again, aligning herself with the doorway. "The first attempt," she said. Miss Marple stood in the doorway watching her. "Yes." Clara raised her hands again, repeating the motion. Pull, tighten, release. But this time the movement felt different. Not practiced, not precise. Uncertain. Interrupted. She lowered her hands. "It did not work," she said. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "No." Clara stepped forward, moving toward the door, following the line into the corridor. "And so it was tried again," she said. "Yes." "In the corridor?" "Yes." Clara reached the center, stopped, the place of repetition, the place where the action had become fixed. She turned to Miss Marple. "It succeeded here," she said. Miss Marple did not immediately answer. Instead, she said, "It was completed here." Clara felt the distinction. "Yes," she said. "Completed." There was silence. Not empty, but full. Clara spoke again. "A knot," she said. "A ribbon. Something tied." "Yes." "But not decoration." "No." "Something functional." "Yes." Clara's breath slowed. "A restraint," she said. Miss Marple met her eyes. "Yes." Clara felt the understanding deepen. Someone was being held, she said. "Yes." "In the room." "Yes." They resisted. "Yes." The action failed. Yes. They moved. Yes. Into the corridor. Yes. Clara's voice dropped. And there, she stopped. Miss Marple did not finish the sentence for her. Clara turned slowly, looking down the corridor again. The glass panes held the light in broken reflections. The tiles lay quiet beneath her feet, but the space was no longer neutral. It was specific, occupied, not by presence, by memory. They were restrained here, she said. Yes. And the action was repeated. Yes. Until it held. Miss Marple inclined her head. Clara closed her eyes briefly. And then? Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. Then we must ask what restraint was required for. Clara opened her eyes. To prevent something, she said. Yes. To stop someone. Yes. Clara turned to her. Or to silence them. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Clara felt the final piece approach, not yet fully formed, but near. Dr. Harbury, she said. Yes. He arranged the meeting. Yes. He came here. Yes. He intended to say something. Yes. Clara's voice tightened. And something went wrong. Miss Marple's expression was very gentle. My dear, something had already gone wrong. Clara stared at her. The letter, she said. It says what has been done cannot be undone. Yes. Clara felt the weight of that. He had already done something, she said. Yes. And the meeting was to address it. Yes. Clara turned away, walking the length of the corridor once more. And instead, she said, it became something else. Yes. She stopped at the far end, turned. I looked back, the full length, the full line, from my room, or to the corridor, to completion. And then she said, very quietly, he did not mean to kill them. Miss Marple did not answer. Clara looked at her. But he did, she said. Miss Marple's silence was confirmation enough. Clara felt a slow, heavy understanding settle. And Mrs. Price, she said. Yes. She knows. Yes. She's always known. Yes. Clara exhaled. And she repeats it. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Clara's voice dropped further. Not to remember. No. To finish it. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the mark at the centre of the corridor. Yes, she said. To finish it. Clara stood very still. Because it was not finished, she said. No. It was interrupted. Yes. Clara looked down at her hands. At the moment of completion, she said, yes. And so it continues. Yes. Clara raised her head. Then the only way to stop it, Miss Marple met her eyes, is to understand it fully, Clara nodded. And to bring it to an end. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Yes. There was a pause. Then Clara said, we must speak to her. Miss Marple did not object. No, she said. We must. Clara turned toward the house, toward the entrance hall, toward Mrs. Price. And as she stepped forward, she understood that the repetition was not merely an action. It was a demand. Something had begun. Something had been interrupted. And someone, was waiting for it to be completed, or acknowledged, or ended. And until that happened, the house would not release it. Chapter 12. What was finally said. They did not find Mrs. Price at once. That, Clara realized later, was part of it. The delay, the quiet searching from room to room, even the sense that the house itself was holding back the moment until it was properly prepared. She and Miss Marple moved through the familiar spaces with a new awareness, as though each doorway might reveal not merely a person, but the answer they had come to demand. The drawing room was empty. The dining room held only the faint after scent of polish and last night's wine. The kitchen was occupied by the maid, who looked up with mild surprise and said that Mrs. Price had been about, though she could not say precisely where. Where does she go? Clara asked. When she is not in one of the usual rooms. The girl hesitated. Well, sometimes she goes to the back, she said, to see that everything is in order. Or to the old rooms, if something needs checking. The treatment wing, Clara said. Yes. Oh, miss! Clara and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. They did not hurry, but they did not delay either. The path to the treatment wing felt different now, not because it had changed, but because Clara no longer moved through it without expectation. The glass corridor lay ahead, still and quiet in the late afternoon light. No sound, no movement, but the hour was not yet 9. This is not the time, Clara said. No, said Miss Marple, but time is not always as rigid as one supposes, particularly when it has been disturbed. They reached the door of the hydrotherapy room. It was not closed. It stood slightly ajar, as though someone had entered without quite completing the motion of shutting it behind them. Clara pushed it open. Mrs. Price stood inside. She was at the centre of the room, exactly where Clara had stood earlier, her back to the door, her hands held before her as though she were about to perform some small, precise task. For a moment she did not turn. Then she said, without looking, I wondered when you would come. Clara stepped forward. You knew? Yes. Mrs. Price turned. Her face was composed, not defensive, not afraid, but settled. You have been observing, she said. It was only a matter of time. Clara felt a sudden, sharp clarity. You have been repeating it, she said. Every night. The same movement. The same place. Yes. Why? Mrs. Price regarded her quietly. Because it was not finished, she said. Clara's breath steadied. What happened here? She asked. Mrs. Price did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room, her gaze moving slowly across the tiled walls, the empty fixtures. The space that held the memory of use. It was not meant to happen here, she said at last. It began as a conversation, that is all. A conversation that had been postponed for too long. Dr. Harbury, Clara said. Yes. Mrs. Price's voice did not change. He asked me to meet him, she continued. At the usual time, we had spoken before, about certain matters, but never directly, never completely. The letter, Clara said. Yes. Mrs. Price's gaze returned to her. He believed that clarity would resolve things, that if he explained himself properly, everything could be arranged. Arranged, Clara repeated. Yes. There was something in the way she said it that made the word feel different. He had done something, Clara said. Before that meeting? Mrs. Price inclined her head. Yes. What? Mrs. Price did not answer at once. And instead she said, there are actions which, once taken, cannot be undone. He knew that. He said as much, but he believed that acknowledgement would be sufficient, that if he spoke of it calmly, rationally, it would become manageable. Clara felt a tightening in her chest. And you did not agree? No. Mrs. Price's voice remained steady. I had been there, she said. I had seen what had been done. I understood the consequences. He did not, or would not. What had he done? Clara pressed. Mrs. Price looked at her. He had ended his life, she said. Clara felt the words settle. Accidentally, she said. Mrs. Price's expression did not change. He would have said so, she replied, and perhaps in the moment it was, but the moment does not exist in isolation. It follows from what comes before. Clara exhaled slowly. And you came here, she said, to confront him? Yes. Mrs. Price's hands moved slightly, not fully, just enough to suggest the beginning of the motion Clara now knew so well. We began here, she said, in this room. He spoke. I listened. He explained. I refused to accept it. And then? Mrs. Price's gaze shifted to the doorway. He attempted to leave, she said. Clara felt the pattern align. You stopped him. Yes. How? Mrs. Price lifted her hands, very slightly. I held him, she said, only to prevent him from walking away, to make him finish what he had begun. Clara's voice dropped. And he resisted. Yes. And the action failed. Mrs. Price's hands still. Yes. Clara stepped closer. And so you moved, she said. Mrs. Price nodded. Yes. They both turned almost instinctively toward the door, toward the corridor beyond. The same line, Clara said. Yes. The same path. Yes. Clara's voice was very quiet. And in the corridor, Mrs. Price closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. In the corridor, she said. I tried again. Her hands moved now, deliberately, precisely. Pull, tighten, release. The motion was exact, practiced, not learned, remembered. I didn't intend, she began, and then stopped. Clara waited. Mrs. Price's voice, when it came again, was unchanged. I intended only to hold him, she said, to make him stay, to make him finish speaking, to make him acknowledge what had been done. And instead, Mrs. Price's gaze did not waver. He fell, she said. Clara felt the words land. Fell? Yes. Mrs. Price's hands lowered. There was a struggle, she said. Not violent, not deliberate, but sufficient. He lost his balance. The floor is smooth. The angle is slight. It was enough, Clara's breath caught. And he struck. Yes. Mrs. Price did not elaborate. She did not need to. Clara saw it. The fall, the impact, the stillness that followed. And then, she said, Mrs. Price's expression remained composed. And then, she said, there was silence. Clara felt the weight of it. And you did not call for help. Mrs. Price met her gaze. No. Why? Mrs. Price's voice did not change. Because it would not have altered the outcome, she said. And because the action was not finished. Clara stared at her. What do you mean? Mrs. Price's hands moved again. The same motion. The same pattern. Pull. Tighten. Release. He had not acknowledged it, she said. He had not completed what he had begun. And so, you repeated it, Clara said. Yes. Clara felt the final understanding settle. Not to remember, she said. No. To complete it. Yes. Miss Marple spoke then for the first time. My dear Mrs. Price, she said gently, you have been trying to finish a moment that cannot be finished in that way. Mrs. Price turned to her. I know, she said. There was no denial, no resistance, only recognition. And yet, she continued, it remains. Yes, said Miss Marple, because it requires something else. Mrs. Price's gaze held hers. What? Miss Marple stepped forward. Not repetition, she said. Acknowledgement. Mrs. Price was very still. He never acknowledged it, she said. No, said Miss Marple. But you have. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Price said, it is not the same. No, said Miss Marple, it is not, but it is sufficient. Mrs. Price looked down at her hands. They still move, she said. Yes. The pattern continues. Yes. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet, only because it has not yet been allowed to end. Mrs. Price raised her head. How does one end it? Miss Marple met her eyes. One stops, she said, and accept that it cannot be completed. Mrs. Price stood very still. Then slowly she lowered her hands, completely. For the first time the motion did not follow. The space held, waited. Nothing happened. Clara felt a shift, not in the room, in the pattern. Mrs. Price exhaled, a small breath, but distinct. It is finished, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, and in that moment, the repetition, which had continued night after night, action after action, ceased. Not dramatically, not visibly, but completely, because it had been understood and allowed to end. Chapter 13. The Shape That Remained. In the days that followed, nothing remarkable happened. That, Clara thought, was the most remarkable thing of all. The house resumed its ordinary life with a quiet efficiency that might have suggested nothing had ever been disturbed. Breakfasts were taken. Letters arrived. The Fenwick sisters disagreed with renewed vigour, as though some invisible constraint had been removed. Mr. Vale complained of drafts with greater confidence. Mr. Crewe discovered new faults in familiar systems. Even the maid moved with a lighter step, though she would not have been able to say why. Mrs. Price continued her duties. She arranged flowers. She adjusted the curtains. She ensured that every small necessity was met before it could be requested. To any casual observer she was unchanged, and yet she was not. Clara noticed it first in the smallest of ways. The ribbons, they were still present, still tied, still neat, but the motion had altered, not in its appearance. The knots remained precise, but in its origin. There was no longer the faint hesitation before the pull, no slight tightening beyond what was required, no repetition of the gesture once it had been completed. One knot, one action, finished. The scent of lavender remained, but it no longer gathered in the corridor at the same hour. It drifted as scent should, lightly, without insistence, without returning to a particular place as though summoned. The glass corridor itself became simply a passage again. People crossed it without pause, without awareness, without interruption. Clara crossed it several times that week. She did not stop in the middle. She did not hear the sound. She did not feel the presence. And yet, she did not forget. On the third evening after their conversation, Miss Marple suggested a walk in the garden. The light had begun to soften, the terraces holding the last of the day in quiet layers of pale gold and shadow. The lavender bushes, trimmed and orderly, gave off a faint scent as the air cooled. They walked without speaking for some time. Then Clara said, "It is over." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It feels ordinary again." "Yes." Clara glanced at her. "That seems insufficient." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, ordinary is often the most complete form of resolution. It means that whatever disturbance existed has been absorbed, not erased, not forgotten, but placed where it belongs." Clara considered this. "And Mrs. Price, she will continue," said Miss Marple. "In the only way she can." Clara looked toward the house. "She's not afraid," she said. "No." "She's not relieved." "No." Clara frowned slightly. "Then what is she?" Miss Marple paused, touching one of the lavender stems lightly. "She's finished," she said. Clara felt the word settle, finished, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of completion. They resumed walking. After a while, Clara said, "And Dr. Harbury?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "In St. Mary Mead there was a man who believed himself entirely justified in everything he had ever done. He arranged his life accordingly. His accounts were in order. His actions, in his own view, were reasonable. It was only when something interrupted that arrangement, something he had not accounted for, that the truth became visible. Not to him, but to others." Clara listened. "He never acknowledged it?" she asked. "No," said Miss Marple, "he did not." "And so?" "And so," said Miss Marple, "his story was completed without his participation." Clara felt a quiet understanding. "That is what happened here," she said. "Yes." They reached the second terrace. The glass corridor stood above them, its panes reflecting the fading light. It no longer held any suggestion of movement or pause. It was simply what it appeared to be, a connection between two parts of the house. Clara looked up at it. "It is strange," she said, "how something can remain in a place without being visible." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but that is often the case. Places to remember, not in any supernatural way, you understand, but through the habits they have witnessed, the actions they have contained. Those things leave traces, not always physical, but real." Clara nodded. "And when those actions are understood," she said, "the trace changes." "Yes." They stood for a moment longer. Then Clara said, "I thought, at first, that the repetition was a form of memory. But it was not, was it? No, said Miss Marple, it was a form of incompleteness. Clara exhaled. And now, said Miss Marple, it has been allowed to become memory. There was a quietness in that, not emptiness, not absence, but a settled state. They turned back toward the house. At the door, Clara paused. Will it return? She asked. Miss Marple looked at her. The action? She said. No. The feeling? Miss Marple considered. Feelings have a way of returning, she said, but not in the same form, not in the same place. That is what makes them bearable. Clara nodded. They went inside. The entrance hall was as it had always been, the black and white tiles, the umbrella stand, the long table beneath the mirror. The flowers had been changed again. Not lavender this time, but white stocks and a few late roses, arranged with the same quiet care. Mrs. Price stood at the table adjusting a stem. She looked up as they entered. My dear Miss Marple, she said, I was just thinking of you. I wondered whether the garden was agreeable this evening. Very much so, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Price smiled. And Miss Whitcomb? It was exactly as it should be, Clara said. Mrs. Price inclined her head. I am glad. She returned to her arrangement. Her hands moved with their usual precision, but there was no repetition, no excess, no unfinished motion. Clara watched her for a moment. Then she said, It is settled. Mrs. Price did not look up. Yes, she said. There was nothing more to be said. Clara turned to Miss Marple. Will you be staying long? She asked. Miss Marple smiled. My dear, one never quite knows. But I think in this case my presence is no longer required. Clara felt a small, unexpected sadness. You have been very helpful, she said. Miss Marple's expression softened. I have merely observed, she said, and occasionally pointed out what was already there. Clara nodded. They stood together for a moment longer. Then Miss Marple said, almost as if to herself, people are the same everywhere. They do what they can to live with what they have done. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they do not. But it is always the same struggle. Oh, whether in a small village or a place like this. Clara looked at her. And in this case, Miss Marple glanced toward Mrs. Price, who continued to arrange the flowers with quiet attention. In this case, she said gently, it has been understood. They parted soon after. Clara went upstairs to her room. She stood for a moment at the window, looking out over the terraces, the lavender bushes now only faint shapes in the gathering dusk. The house was quiet, not empty, not silent, but at rest. She turned away, and as she closed the curtain, she noticed, almost without thinking, that the ribbon holding it in place was tied neatly, simply, and without any excess. One knot, complete. She didn't touch it. She did not need to, because for the first time since her arrival, there was nothing in the house that required repeating, only remembering. And that, Clara thought, was a far gentler thing.